All right, we are live. Welcome to episode 44 of the Super Sports Show. I'm Eric Eager. I'm joined by Thomas Dimitrov. We are in the Atlanta office. We're just gotten done, Thomas, with a big day full of meetings, planning for the draft. We are only, carry the two, right? Just 24 days until the draft. We're going to talk wide receivers today, Thomas. How you doing?
24 days to the draft. We were in the middle of talking business deals with Paul Tudor Jones, trying to figure out where we're going. We have so much on our plates, and yet, you know this in the back of your mind, all you can think about is a draft. I couldn't wait all day to get to this point to talk about wide receivers.
I know, for sure. And we thank you all for coming today to this live version of the show. We'll obviously put this up on the podcast platforms for you. If you are new to the show, obviously we stream every Monday and Wednesday night up until the draft. We're going to do position previews, and then coming on the Thursday night of the draft, we are going to do a live draft show half hour before, all the way until the end of the first round. So if your team picks in the first round, you get to see us talk about and analyze that. So we are in a fun spot there, Thomas. When you think about the wide receiver position in this draft, I'm just going to throw up a few of the guys here. These are the betting odds by our friends at DraftKings. Jaxon Smith-Njigba from Ohio State. He's minus 225 to go as the first wide receiver taken. Interestingly, Zay Flowers is 4-1. Quinten Johnston, who many believe, including like Pro Football Focus, believes is the best wide receiver sort of in their ranking. He's 5-1. Jordan Addison, formerly of Pittsburgh and now of USC, 10-1. Jalen Hyde of Tennessee, who we won't talk about today, 22-1. And Josh Downs is basically 100-1 to go as the first wide receiver taken. Thomas, when you think about just overview of this group, you drafted a wide receiver in the top 10. You drafted a wide receiver in the first round. Both guys became Pro Bowl caliber players. Obviously Julio Jones, and then from there Calvin Ridley. Like, where do you see this wide receiver group stack up? Because it's kind of similar, right? In the way you took a guy high in a group that had to, AJ Green and Julio, and then you took a guy in Ridley who was in a class where the first wide receiver didn't go until the end of the first round or so. So what do you think about this class sort of holistically here?
I think holistically this class, it's a good solid class, and I think there's depth in the class. I wouldn't look at this class and say, man, there are 5 studs that you're just on the edge of your seat ready to yank that tag off the board. Of course, I am a believer in you can have athletes, and we did it really fast, separation athletes like Ridley, very different phenotypically. You guys are going to get mad at me for using that word, but physically very different than when Julio Jones came out, right? This is not a big class of receivers. There's some speed here, some quick twitch, some ability to separate, which we know is really important, but there's not a lot of that bigger, tall 6'3", 6'4" guy. Of course, that makes it different.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the big problems here is when you look at wide receivers nowadays in the NFL, you have guys who can be incredibly valuable as players, even if they aren't the full package. 25 to 30 years ago, every single offense was in either 21 personnel or 12 personnel, and that wide receiver for you, both of those guys had to be starters. If you went up into the draft and took a guy in the first round, that guy had to be, sort of that quintessential player who was a star for you. And I think, unfortunately, when you look at, nowadays, we often look at it the same. But when you think about wide receivers from the standpoint of, can they be a fit for me? Can they fit into an offense in that kind of role? I do think that there are guys who, they can do a couple things well, right? We talk about the wide receiving core for the Chiefs. They didn't really have a stud number 1 receiver other than their tight end. Their wide receivers all sort of fit a mold. And, I think this class doesn't necessarily include that wide receiver 1 type player unless you squint and look at Smith-Njigba, or a guy like Johnston. But they are guys that if you use them properly, if you give them proper sort of support and you put them in offense without, dependent on doing too many things, they can certainly be valuable.
Look, the receiver position is so incredibly valuable. We took the lead back that many years ago from Bill Polian, right? He put the right people around his Colt team that was rolling, of course, with Manning. And we did the same thing with Matt Ryan. We always were forcing ourselves to think more about having the right, talents around him. So you have some young quarterbacks out there. You need some good receivers around them, of course. You need the number one. I mean, our decisions were always based on, is this receiver a number one, or is this receiver a number two, while you look for your next number one. So for us, again, with Ridley, we knew eventually we were going to lose Julio. Ridley was going to come in, be our number two, potentially be a number one until we found another stud that might be 6'2" or 6'3" that could carry us into the next, combination of, let me put it this way, number one and number 1A or 1 and 1B, right? That was a big thing for us. So I would say here, when we get into talking about these guys, understand it's really, really important. Some people press the need, though. You don't want to go too high for a receiver because you could get some good receivers at a good place in this year's draft and not press it. If you're not overly committed to the fact that Jaxon Smith-Njigba does not have the blazing speed you're looking for, you have to really dig in on that. Of course he can separate. Of course he's a very good athlete, but he's an inside guy.
Yeah.
In my mind, I think he's best suited there, and that's worth us talking about.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you look back at your Patriot days, right, where you had, in the early years when you guys were winning championships, you had David Gibbons, David Patton, Deion Branch was a high pick, but not, I guess, anybody's sort of idea of what a number one receiver looked like. Then it's Jabbar Gaffney, and then it's, guys like that. And then, you go out and get Moss, Welker, your last year there, Stallworth, and you sort of had seasons of building different receiver corps. Then you go to Atlanta and you have Roddy White's already there, Julio's there. That's your 1A, 1B for a while, and that got you, to the NFC title game. And then Julio, when you made the Super Bowl in 2016, then it was Julio supported by a bunch of players who were more sort of secondary guys. So there are many ways to do this, and you can't force it, I think is a really good point. And so let's start with Quinten Johnston, of TCU. He didn't run the 40, at least I haven't seen it yet. I do think we're sort of in that 4.45 range. A 40.5-inch vertical, 11-foot broad is pretty solid. He was 10th in college football in terms of yards per route run, and he averaged almost 9 yards per catch after the catch was 11th. He did have almost 12% of his target drop. So there are, when I looked at him, Thomas, I kind of I thought of kind of a weaker version of what Terrell Owens was, in that kind of a body catcher guy, kind of a separator guy, good yards after the catch, but when that ball's in the air, he's not going to make you forget about Randy Moss at all. He's not going to snag the ball with his hands. And so to me, obviously Terrell Owens is an amazing football player, contributed to a lot of great offenses, but it's that type. And I wonder, is he explosive enough to sort of fill out that exact role, that sort of big boy wide receiver role, the yards after the catch guy, if he maybe isn't quite the athlete that those guys were.
No, look, I think he is still, I personally believe he's a very good athlete. For me, that's a 7 in our scale. I'm not saying he's the 8 with a 9, the top end rare, but I think his body control, his ability to move around is very good. I'm concerned, as we all are, on the idea of his hands, of course, but he can separate, he can get deep. The yards after catch are very impressive. He's not the stop-start, the guy who's leaving people in the dust that way. He is a very good football player, all in all, short of trying to figure out his hands. And let me just say that is a place where you beat your head into the wall as personnel men, right? Because this was an interesting thing. Bill Belichick never let us drop a 5 on hands. Either it was a 4, which was average, or it was a 6, which was good. Because as scouts by trade, we like to find that midline place sometimes, and it's tough for us to commit sometimes. This is one of those guys where I think a lot of people are wondering what truly are his hands, and how do you determine? Remember, everyone, you can judge hands on the ability to snap the ball, pluck around you, adjust, catch balls up, down, all over. but there's also the ball skills element of it, right? Some people have really nice hands. They can snag it out of the air, one-handed, whatever they're doing, but they're not tracking the ball correctly, or they're not going up for the ball, as you mentioned, right? There are elements to that play into the ball skills that I think we cannot forget about. And this is a guy where I guarantee if you went into most scouts, they would have their judgment on ball skills, and there would be some questions on the pure overall ball skills.
It sort of reminded me of like this honors class I took in college where they said you either get an A or a C. If you mess around and goof off, you're going to get a C. We're not going to give any of you what was called the gentleman's B. You're either getting an A or a C. And that's interesting on hands because I feel like there are, we think about, and this player kind of cultivates in tons of different, lessons about the wide receiver position. Think about Troy Williamson, right? The Vikings trade Randy Moss to the Raiders for the 7th overall pick and a couple other things. And they go with Troy Williamson, and Williamson just simply can't catch the ball, right? I think that there are guys who simply can't catch the ball. And then there are guys who have concentration issues, right? Like you think about even Julio, who was a fantastic wide receiver, an amazing player, had his concentration issues. Amari Cooper, even further than that, has led the league or been a league leader type player in drops before. He doesn't have bad hands. It's just it's a concentration issue. So and that could be like I think where you worry about analytics so much. You look at it and say, is this something that we can scout? Because I don't think that we can tease it away with analytics. A drop is a drop in many cases, and it's kind of hard to put around it the concentration issue. But as a scout, you can probably discern the difference between those things.
Yeah, like we will go out, we will watch these players during the season in games. We'd watch them at their practice, of course. We'd watch them at All-Star games if they're there. We'd watch them at the Combine. And then we'd go out and we'd usually travel out with if we're especially picking high, travel out with our receiver coach and our O coordinator, and we get our receiver coach to really drill down on these players. Oftentimes in that setting, again, they're plucking the ball and everything looks good. They're doing all these really, really good things as far as catching the ball with ease. And yet it is different when you're on the field a lot, laying down, right? There's just a lot on your mind. I mean, I said the same thing about Julio. I personally think Julio is a first ballot Hall of Famer. There were times with Julio that he would drop balls that you did not expect him to drop. And we were always trying to figure out what that was. We thought he had very good hands. It just had to do with everything else. Sometimes it had to do with a guy like that who was trying to do too much, trying to, of course, the obvious is turning to run early. But in his mind, he's thinking he's got so many other things that he wants to do with the ball after the grab, which is interesting to dig into. We oftentimes, if we ever had issues with people catching or not catching the ball, you guys have probably heard this before, we'd go out and we would do deep dives on the visual, right?
Yeah.
I know that sounds kind of basic in today's world, but there's a lot of that. We have had a lot of receiver coaches who have been around a lot of the best receivers in the league over the last 20 to 30 years. And they are pulling ideas that they used through their whole process.
It's just like everything, though. I mean, like I would say, as somebody who played receiver and tight end, like, I was probably better left-eyed, and then right-handed, and like this way was much easier for me to catch the ball than this way. And like you just, it's the same way that soccer players kick the ball with one leg better than the other. I think unless you train that, and you're not really going to put the work in until you get to some of these like tip-top programs. And even then, you don't sort of know if the research is going to bear fruit. So that one is it's a good question. And I think when we look at, I want to put up another graphic here that we're here. This is from Grinding the Mox. Our friend Ben Robinson, who listens to the show, is also somebody who we like a lot. This is shy right now of any betting market data on over under. We're going to look at draft, expected draft position. The guy that we're going to talk about next, Jaxon Smith-Njigba, he's 14th expected draft position. So middle of round one, Johnston, who we just talked about, 19th, Addison 23, Flowers 26, and then Josh Downs we're going to talk about last, about position 40. That seems about right? Because when we talk about Smith-Njigba, you're looking at kind of not a ton of size, 6 feet, 196, not terrible. Explosiveness stuff, 35-inch vert, that's passable, but it's not like freakish, like a some of the other guys. When you look at average depth of target, not really huge there. And I also like this idea. He was not the top receiver on his own team when he was in college, right? There were guys like Garrett Wilson, rookie of the year last year, Chris Olave, who was also, I think, very good last season. They were playing above him. In 2021, when he did play, he was 18th in college football in yards per catch after the catch. So when you look at him, you said you think of him more as a slot guy. What kind of traits sort of were there / not there for you to sort of think that way?
Yeah, look, I think he can move outside, of course, but in the NFL, his ideal spot is inside slot. And an inside slot guy versus an outside guy, of course, inside is the ability, let's talk about his positives to be an inside guy, to be adept, to be able to move along and be so comfortable through the middle, running routes through the middle. He has a very good ability to separate and run routes. He's a very disciplined route runner, of course. In my mind, I think that's what really separates his ability. He's not the smoker on the outside. Let's just call it the way it is. When you're watching him, I believe with a scout's eye, with a really discerning eye, you realize that there's not that extra burst that you'll see on some of the greats in the past, right? Keep him inside, have him coming across, catching the ball, avoiding. He's got a really good feel that way. Again, back to having very good body control as an athlete, I think is very beneficial. Excellent awareness inside. I'd love to see him really thrive in the inside. I think that's where it's going to be, of course.
Yeah, and you've seen guys make Hall of Fame careers out of being better inside players. Chris Carter, Antonio Brown, guys like that, who are really, really good at that. There's a good question here from Sean Donahoe. How much do you value programs who have consistently produced pro talent? OSU has had a stable, and Brian Hartline is considered an elite wide receiver coach. I mean, I've seen that a lot. Ohio. I think that there could be positives and drawbacks to that, right? Like a guy's given the benefit of the doubt when maybe he shouldn't be, or but there is something to say, like if he can go through this program, there's a second checking off piece that he goes through.
Yeah, we look at the programs for sure at any positions, but in this case as a receiver, we look at how long they've been together. Of course, we also look who's coaching him, who his coordinator is. Does a position coach truly thrive in the development of the receivers? I mean, those are important things for us as well. And again, back to the system, type of routes he's running, of course, and the frequency of what he's running obviously is important for us. In the end, however, we always say the vid does not, or the film does not lie. And I think with a guy like this, you realize that he is a very effective football player and will continue to be so.
Yeah, for sure. And there's such an aspect of making sure that that you don't just helmet scout or whatever that is. You go through and you didn't want to compare Justin Fields to Dwayne Haskins to C.J. Stroud. They're different players, and in many cases, oftentimes they're playing different-ish schemes than before. So I think that the market right now, if you're looking betting market both, but also a lot of the mocks, like he is going the first wide receiver. I'd be interested to see where he goes. I think a lot of people I talk to think he's going to go in the top 10, but a lot of the mocks don't have him going that far. And we do see, Thomas, wide receivers, you oftentimes go later than we think, right? You think Jefferson, Judy, and Lamb all went kind of past 15 in that one draft. All three are great. I think teams are still just a little weary when they see that a guy's kind of not that complete package the way that AJ Green and Julio were in your draft. And even if they're wrong, like they were wrong on Jefferson, but like you kind of can't blame him because Jefferson only played 2 snaps on the outside of the formation his whole time at LSU.
And what's going to be, the issue that's going to drop them down? I didn't hear exactly what you said. What's the projection?
So it's about so right now we don't have betting market data on where they're going to go. So that's always a little bit sharper than mock draft data. But 14 is where Smith-Njigba's average draft position is per grinding the mocks.
Okay.
So that's kind of middle of round 1. That can obviously change. You can go to that website and look at the evolution where it's gone down or up. But that would be a good question to look at.
I would think, I get that 14 area. I would think most, and we do this often as general managers in the league, you look and you're like, okay, ideally this guy's a 25 to 32 guy. And then we move up another 5 picks or we move into the teams. If there's a team that needs a receiver, of course, to go between this guy, of course, and to go between Quinten Johnston, when you think about JSN and Johnston, that's going to be a situation that teams are going to dig in to try to decide what they really need for their system, right? The hands thing is obviously on the favor of JSN. I get that. But just remember, that 14 will be interesting to see if there'll be teams looking for it. And I think ideally he's in the 20s, but if someone needs that position more, I will say this, remember, this is really important. I mentioned this, I think, in a diatribe that I passed along to the group this weekend. It is really important when you're talking about players in our world in scouting to make sure that you are paralleling the same type of player, right?
Yeah.
You're not going to talk about a guy like JSN with a guy who's a 4-2 smoker. You have to pull together the physical side as well as the explosiveness. That's when you're comparing. GMs and head coaches love comparatives from their scouts.
So they love. I said this at the Ohio State conference the other day. I said the most empathetic thing you can do in football is go to the other person's experience. That's always when I talk to you about your career, I can get I can often make a better conversation by paralleling something with something you've experienced before. And when you think about comparables, that's a huge deal. And that's why, if you're an up and coming, you always preach this, but when you're an up and coming person in analytics or in scouting, you do have to have a Rolodex. The league has existed for longer than the past 3 or 4 years, and you have to be able to go back and say, this guy reminds me of this guy. And it's never, people aren't going to like it. I remember when AJ Brown was coming out, I tweeted, obviously, I think AJ Brown reminds me of Terrell Owens. And funny, they both got traded to the Eagles. They both made the Super Bowl when they got traded to the Eagles. But AJ Brown actually quote tweeted me. He's like, "I'm my own guy." It's I get that, But you need to have comparables so that kind of so you can relate the material. And otherwise, I think you're always going to be sort of swimming, and every guy is going to seem so unique. As long as it doesn't cloud your judgment and make every guy go up 5 units.
That's right. And I would say to you, if you were an analytics person and you were getting into the NFL side, or I would even say this now that I'm in this business, I would tell the rising scouts, you want to be really good, you bring out the comparatives, right, of the players, and then fold in 2 or 3 cool, metrics and data that would say, however, this player does this, this, and this, some percent better than this other player that we're comparing to. And remember, this player that we're comparing to ended up being a top 20 pick and was one of the, upper echelon players, right? Those are big things.
Right, because we look at Terrell Owens, we say, and again, we're getting back, but Terrell Owens was a 3rd-round pick out of a Division II school, Tennessee Chattanooga, that, now is FCS. But, you say, we didn't know Terrell Owens. The Knights had Jerry Rice. They traded up with Cleveland, back when you were on Cleveland, to get J.J. Stokes. They thought J.J. Stokes was the guy that Terrell Owens was going to be. And so then Terrell Owens ends up this finished product. But, we're now talking about, Quinten Johnston. He's probably a top 15, 20 pick, and he's going to be more thought of coming into the league than Terrell Owens was when he got in the league. So there's just so much uncertainty here. And, I think that's an important thing to sort of understand is and even AJ Brown was the 2nd round pick.
Yeah.
There were guys, I think, him and Metcalf were both taken in round 2, and that's it's not as easy as it looks. And so these guys are really, really well thought of, even though we're oftentimes comparing them to somebody who wasn't when they came into the league. So BC Zay Flowers, this is one that's really cool for me because back before I joined Sumer, I was doing a lot of college betting. I was doing a lot of college DFS. And this was somebody who I always had in my lineups because he was always so slippery. But he's a little guy, 5'9", 182, 4.42 in the 40, which is good. It's not like a burner type when you're that size. But decent explosiveness. The thing that I find really funny about him is his yards after the catch were both lower than Smith-Njigba and Johnston, even as a smaller guy. But his average at the target is over 15 yards, which is 40-30 college football. They legitimately at Boston College without great quarterbacks were trying to go downfield to him. And so, I don't know. When I watched him, I just wrote down he was open a lot. That is something that matters in the NFL, especially when you don't have the size.
It is. And this is the start to the smaller receivers that are, they're really good. There's some really good receivers here. I think he is he's a 7 athlete in my mind, so he's a very good receiver. A little scaled down because he is a smaller guy, right?
Yeah.
If this guy were to be 4 or 5 inches taller and he's moving around 4 inches taller, you'd be thinking, wow, this guy has the rare type of movement and athleticism. Back to body control, he is a really, really good route runner, and he separates very well, right? The separation in the end is where he is. Let's focus on separation versus pure route running. The stop-start ability that we all know is important before and after is interesting to see. But again, I've had small receivers and I've had big receivers on teams. Some of the smaller receivers you haven't had to snap off the board in the first round. You can do it in the second and third round. And look, Harry Douglas, guys like that we had. I'm not saying Harry was as talented as Zay, but to your point, 4.42 is not 4.32, right?
Yeah. And 4.42 when you're that small is not. I mean, you have to show, in my opinion, that you can make a contested catch. You have to show that you can bounce off a tackle. The other part, and maybe this is a little bit, like I said, I think he's a really good football player. I think he's legitimate. I would say, back half of the first, probably early second is where you're going to find the most value on him, because of the limitations there, and the fact that if you take a wide receiver, so you think about like Sky Moore, George Pickens, Christian Watson, where the Packers erred was they took Christian Watson at the beginning of the second round and needing him to be a starter right away. Where the Chiefs were good at taking Sky Moore was wanting him to develop 1 year. Because when you're taken in round 2 and you sit for a year, that's perfectly acceptable in my opinion. If you're taken in round 2 and you expect the guy to play right away, that's a little bit of a chore. And so when I look at him, I think where are expectations in year 1? Expectations are to play a role on a good football team, right? And that's going to put you in that kind of like 30, 25 to 40 range, probably maybe a trade up from a good team. Then it's really going to take you, in a top 15 sort of place where you got to be, like I said, like back in the day, you had to be everything at wide receiver. You had to be, you had to be jams from the inside and the outside. You had to play, you had to play that X position or the Z position, which just require a lot of a receiver. And if you're taking a little bit later in the draft and you fail, let's say on the outside, and they salvage you on the inside, that's not a failed draft pick in my opinion. If you're taking 10th and you have the result in that, that's a failed draft pick. And so I think that that's more where the expectations are for me with him. I do get a little worried about things like special teams because wide receivers nowadays, you have to play special teams when you're that small. It's hard to run down on kicks. It's hard to be a blocker on returns and stuff like that. So there is a little bit of a limitation. Even for him to be like, does he dress on game day if he's not a starting receiver type of thing?
Yeah, I mean, and this is where we go. Remember, usually when you're writing up reports on the personnel side, you're writing up, is he an outside guy, is he an inside guy? And we do often, if it's outside, however you prioritize, if he's more outside, then it's O/I, of course, in the description of Y. Of course, this guy's ability to run routes from the inside and do whatever, and he's not a big guy to be on the outside, right? I get that. In the end, is this guy more than a number 2 in the league? And most teams would say he's a deuce, right?
Yeah.
He's a deuce. Now, where does that 2 go? Well, you can pick a 2, like you said, the back end of the first round. There's going to be a lot of people out there if they had the druthers. They'd love to pop him in the top 10 of the second. But he doesn't. I don't believe he gets there. I believe he gets out at the back end of the first.
Yeah, there's a lot of talent there for sure. Now, let's talk about a guy who I think when you look at expectations going into the season and expectations coming out of the season, 2022 is a disappointment for Jordan Addison, right? When you look at when he paired with Kenny Pickett at Pittsburgh, one of the more productive receivers in all of football. Once Pickett graduated, went to the Steelers, there was sort of an NIL bidding war for Jordan Addison's services. He ends up going to USC, again, playing with another great quarterback, right? He goes, Pickett's a first-round guy. Whether he deserves to be or not is another story. Pickett's a first-round guy. Caleb Williams is a legitimate Heisman guy, wins the award. 2.94 yards per route run, 23rd, that's good, but, only 12.4 average at the target, 143rd in football, only 6.6 yards per catch after the catch, 64th. He had about 10% drop rate. This is one where you are buying the dip on a player because he was expected to be much more. At 5'11", 173, only a 4.49 in the 40 at the combine. This is one where I would not be surprised at all if you didn't see him go in day one.
You wouldn't be surprised if he did go there. Yeah. No, look, I completely agree. You start getting into the 170s, and I mentioned this before, and all of a sudden he gets into your camp, he's 173. Majority of times they will be dropping down into the 65s and 68s. You start getting really light. My point is that we had that with back to Harry Douglas. We pushed him every year. We thought he was going to be up, and we were always battling his weight to stay up. So it's a legit concern when you have a younger guy like that who is pushing. That said, I think he's a good football player, and again, good as a number 2 in the league. And his ability to run routes, I think, are good. He's got that ability to, stick his foot in the ground and make people miss, which I like that as well. What was his drop rate, by the way?
9.9, so about 1 in every 10 targets he dropped.
And his percentage, where was he in the world of?
Yeah, it's like, in the top 1/6, like a pretty high rate for a guy that's probably supposed to be I think going into the year, we thought he was a first round pick, right? A top 10 guy. And that's, by the way, like people talk about Marvin Harrison Jr., you talk about guys like that are going into their final year. Just be careful with those guys, right? Because the more data you get on them, generally speaking, for guys who are amazing, they can only really go down. And it's probably also a good lesson for a player where, it's sort of, maybe this is an interesting topic because Jaxon Smith-Njigba barely played last year, right? And he's going to end up being probably, by the markets, the first wide receiver taken. Jamar Chase similarly with LSU in 2020. When you are looking at this from a team building standpoint, if a guy doesn't play that final year, is it a case by case basis or does it legitimately become a point of contention?
It's, for me, a point of contention. It always has been. I mean, those odd situations where a player doesn't play that much or he's not a starter, even though they're really athletic and they're fast, whether it's receiver or linebacker, right? It's always on my mind as a team or a general manager to sit there and press that to my head coach or to my owner that we're going to go after this guy in the first round who hasn't, his play time is off.
Yeah.
He's not, that's a concern. So, look, to your point, I would not be surprised if he didn't go in the first round. It would be tough for me to think that he would. But I was expecting big things coming. I really like the kid's confidence. I just see the way that he confidence in general. Maybe it's in my mind that he left Pitt to go to USC and is like, wow, that takes a lot of stones to do something like that in my mind. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's for sure. I think, he's a good ball player, and there are guys who, for example, like Stephon Diggs, who didn't do as well, their whole college career, but we're good players, and maybe the situation wasn't great. There's also acclimation, right? There's acclimating to a new team that can be a problem, and there are all kinds of reasons why. I think that a player could have issues like that, and so for him, he's probably going to drop out, but I wouldn't be surprised if he ended up having a good NFL career. And lastly, this one's an interesting one. This is Josh Downs from UNC. Like I said, on Grinding the Mocks, an average draft position of about 40. He's 5'9", 171, just a little guy, 4.48 in the 40. But 38.5 inch vert, which is pretty impressive, 10.11 broad jump. So a very explosive guy, 2.8 yards per route run in his final year at UNC, 32nd in college football. 9% drop rate's a little bit better than what Addison had, but not by much. 7.5 yards per catch after the catch, 33rd. I thought he was slippery after the catch. He looked faster on the field for sure than I think those numbers indicated. Playing in the ACC is not playing in the SEC, but it really was an interesting eval for him.
Yeah, and I watched him. I think, again, another good player, another ideal second round type of player who's a deuce, potentially comes in as a third. And, does he have the ability to raise up to be a 2? I shouldn't say that because I'm not necessarily sure if he does. Again, good in a number of his skills. When I watched him, there were times when I thought, how does this guy have an extra burst? Does he have speed? Then he'd pull away, right? And I'd think, well, that's a good-looking football player who looks smooth when he's running.
Yeah.
But again, he's not one of those guys at size that I was blown away by. and really taken aback by his ability to make people miss in the open field and stop-start, explosiveness. You know, he didn't grab my attention that same way. You know, the idea that he's a slot, he is truly only a slot. You're not putting him on the outside in the NFL. He's an interior guy, and he's a smart guy, and he's got good awareness, so I think that's obviously the benefit.
Yeah, for sure. I think that, you know, for me, you know, it was very much a situation where you look at him and you're like, this is a contributor. This is not a difference maker, I think. And like, you know, and at wide receiver, like we'll talk about a little bit of my work at PFF, like in the playoffs, in late season games against great defenses, your offense does go as your number 2, 3, and 4 receivers go, because as you know, like, you know, the great teams can take away your best option, so you need that second, third, fourth option. And your best offenses when you were a general manager or a director of college scouting were always ones that had those receivers. So this is a player who can make a difference to a team winning or not, but it's not necessarily a player who, you know, you're going to build an offense around, unfortunately. I think, and so 40 seems a little bit rich for my blood as well, just because you know, you're kind of going to a team who's picking in the top 10. You're going to be their second pick, which doesn't necessarily feel all that great. But this has been a free agency class where wide receivers have made hardly anything, and so there are openings here. The two big guys that I want to sort of talk about though is like when you're thinking about, you know, as we finish the show up, when you're thinking about positions in the draft. Does it ever creep into your mind the guys that are available in free agency or trade at the time, right? So when you were at the Patriots in 2007, Randy Moss was available, you got him for a 4th round pick. Right now, DeAndre Hopkins is available for trade, Odell Beckham Jr. is available in free agency. Does that at all change your approach, or should it? Like I personally think, like, if you're drafting a position that you need to win that year, you're already screwed, because those guys just almost never contribute the way you expect early. Does it factor in at all, or is it almost completely two different evaluations?
I want to make sure I understand what you're saying. You're talking about the fact that these free agents are out there available?
Yeah, like Kansas City. So everybody, you know, Chiefs Kingdom wants to know this from me as one of the prominent, you know, sort of fans. You know, sort of in the space, but they're like, you know, the Chiefs need this at wide receiver, they need that at wide receiver, and I'm like, well, if they're drafting a wide receiver because of something they need in 2023, that's not a good draft pick. That's all you, as you said, almost all mistakes come out of desperation. So, do you think that? But like free agency signs to build 1 year, it's not effective. It's not, you know, a great use of money long term, as we found out at Super here for sure. But like, is there any intersection between those two availabilities? Guys available in free agency versus guys available in the draft?
I mean, there it is. I mean, we go in, as we've talked from the very beginning, when we look at our game plan and our scenarios, we look at the receivers, we realize our druthers would never be to snap a receiver out of free agency, just because of how expensive they would be most of the time. And quite honestly, most of the time, if those guys ever leave their teams, there is a reason. Tyreek Hill, there's reasons these guys are leaving their teams. Because coaches and GMs are way too smart to let go of those people that are complete difference makers. So to me, it's a different thing. I start looking in free agency and I start thinking, okay, is there a bona fide 3 out there that's going to give us leadership ability, going to give us experience and the smartness and intelligence within our receiver room? We already have our number 1. We need to go out there and get the 1A or the number 2 receiver, and that's where we're going to go out in the draft. And that's where these play out, right? When you start talking, you said his projection was 40?
Yeah, pick 40.
Yeah, pick 40. Like, pick 40 seems rich to me.
Yeah.
But again, I feel like I'm always, you know, half a round or more, you know, later, and understand that sometimes you'll be moving up. But
and is that, by the way, like, just to give a thinking, you know, of where you are, because last year there was a team that I was working with a little bit that said, look, we only have 18 first-round picks on our board, right? And so we're picking here. What's the likelihood that we even get one of these guys? And I'm like, we have this conversation every year. you only have 18 first-round guys on your board every freaking year. And I think, like, you just said, like, I'm always going to be a little lower on these guys. Is there ever a year where you're like, I have 36 guys that are first-round picks? Or do you get more, like, I feel like everybody, you know, when I was a professor, everybody got more crotchety and, like, you were like, oh, these students these days suck compared to back in the day. Like, is that how it goes? Is it just like your standards get higher and higher, you look at more flaws, you're more aware of flaws, or are players less? I mean, I could buy that players are less, you know, prepared now than they were back in the day. You know, especially now that they're transferring so much, they're getting so much less of a scheme understanding where they're going. But like, how? Because that's an interesting question, right? Like, are there ever years where you are like, no, actually, there's like 40 players I take around?
We rarely ever had that. But I will say we would settle in, not at 18, that seems really low. We would settle at 25. We were doing our mocks and going, wow, we need to get some more people up here on this board. And then easily you start looking at the second, and you're like, okay, there's 3 or 4 people here. I know the Raiders like them. I know the Cowboys through all of our interaction around the league. Before you know it, you're adding another 6 there, and you're fine, right?
Yeah.
You take guys, you know, that are more. It's usually by the situation of injury or complete D-bags that are out there, to be honest with you, who have dropped out of the first round.
Yeah, that's so interesting, right? Because that would obviously mean that trading up, it obviously is more value than the nerds say, because there are only so many players that are you know, valuable there. But also trading back is valuable too, because there are teams that think that they need to get a first rounder, and like they're going to value pick, like, let's say 15 more than they maybe should, because they think it's 15 of just 18 guys that they'll actually get. One sobering message here before we go. Here are the second round picks. We talk about these guys. Here are the second round wide receivers and the number of wide receiving yards they got last year. Christian Watson, 6'11". We also had Wan'Dale Robinson, who I freaking forgot was the second round pick, 227 yards, 247 yards for Tyquan Thornton, 801 for George Pickens, the high water mark there. Alec Pierce, 593. Sky Moore for the Super Bowl champion Chiefs at 250. And then that was it, really, for wide receivers who contributed there. So, again, you know, we're looking at the top 5 receivers in this draft. Some of them will be taken in round 2, and in all likelihood, in 2023, you probably don't want them on your fantasy football team. So, you know, that's I think a sobering message here. But Thomas, we got off to a little bit of a late start, but I thought that this was great. Thank you all for being patient with our new setup here. This was a lot of fun. I you know, really love just talking positions with you next time, Wednesday. We're still going to be here, I think. And we're going to talk about tight ends. And that's a position that I played for a few years in college. So I have maybe some more football opinions on it. But the wide receiver position here, I think, was really cool because, again, there's guys who are legitimately going to go in round 1, but we also got to talk about some guys that go in round 2. So if you like this podcast, please hit the like button on YouTube, subscribe, rate, review wherever you get your podcasts, and continue to, you know, sort of support the show every Monday, every Wednesday. So for Thomas Mitchoff, this has been Eric Eager. This has been the Sumer Sports Show.